Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 94. The Seleucids Lose the Seas. Last time, we saw Polixenides lure the Rhodian fleet into an ambush, as well as Antiochus III failed to take Pergamum alongside his son Seleucus. Today, we will see the scales of war tip far more decisively one way. However, I do not think Antiochus will like which way they end up tipping. At the end of episode 93, Antiochus III headed towards Notium, which was a settlement or resettlement of the town of Colophon. He wanted to control it because it was very close to the Seleucid city of Ephesus. Moreover, Colophon was a Roman ally, and so it told everything that went on in the city straight to Rome. Once the Romans found out their ally of Notium was under siege, Antiochus reckoned, they would move their fleet off Samos to come to the city's aid. This would allow Polixenides to attack them, as he had failed to do right at the end of last episode. Therefore, taking the city would be a double whammy against the Romans. So, a siege began, with walls being constructed right down to the seafront. Predictably, the citizens felt scared and sent word to Rome. Their message arrived to praetor Lucius Aemilius over on Samos. Now, Aemilius had been impatient to get off Samos even before the messenger showed up. He was also riled by the idea that the Pergamon fleet would get the glory of moving the Roman troops into Asia with the consuls, while he was stuck on protection duty on Samos. Basically, he was getting restless. So, he set out from Samos to look for supplies and from there relieve the city. The Roman fleet headed for Chios, an important granary island for the Romans. Halfway there, they turned towards Teos, either to relieve them of wine supplies the Romans could not get and which had been prepared for the Seleucids, or else to attack them. Just as they were wheeling around, although I suppose that's not really the word I'm looking for, sails were sighted off the island of Myonessus. 15 ships showed up. Aemilius gave chase, believing these were standard Seleucid ships. Instead, it turned out they were quick-moving pirate ships which had been raiding off Chios and were now coming back. So, their speed allowed them to escape to safety. Their refuge was Myonessus, which was a piece of land jutting out between Teos and Samos. The Romans didn't dare approach, as they were worried about bumping into pirate attacks from the mainland. So, at length, they left the pirates behind and headed on to Teos, plundering whatever they could. Teos sent out envoys to the Romans, begging them for an end to hostilities. However, Aemilius didn't want to hear it, and accused Teos of helping the enemy. If, he said, the people of Teos would give him the same amount of stuff they'd said they would give Polixenides, his men would stop. Dismayed, Teos went to discuss amongst itself. At the same time, Polixenides set out from Colophon with the Seleucid navy. He found out that the Romans had ended up at Teos after being delayed by a bunch of pirates. So, he landed opposite Myonessus in a hidden harbour. He then scouted out the Romans. His plan was to trap them in the harbour, just as he'd managed to trap the Rhodians under Pausistratus. Now, this wasn't a bad idea. The harbour of Myonessus on the island of Teos narrowed into a very narrow bottleneck, which would make his aim easier. So, he moved to take the harbour during the cover of night. This didn't work, because the Romans unexpectedly moved during the night after the island of Teos came back to them and agreed to their terms. So, Aemilius had moved his fleet round to an easier location to get supplies. It also helped the Romans that a crash blocking the harbour earlier on had pointed out how risky of a location the original harbour was. At around noon the following day, while the Romans were loading their ships, a peasant was hauled before Aemilius, and told him that, for a few days now, there had been another fleet anchored where Polixenides had originally been. In fact, the peasant said, it looked like it was about to move. Emilius immediately realised what was going on and gave the order to move out. Soldiers were recalled from wherever they were across the country, and the town descended into a chaotic mess of soldiers shouting and milling around. In point of fact, Emilius only managed to avoid panic by sailing his ship out a little way, giving an example for the others to follow. So, the Roman fleet managed to get out of the harbour, with their Rhodian allies following behind. In between Myonessus and our old battleground of Coricus, they spotted the Seleucid fleet. Now, the Seleucid fleet was extended so much they would be able to envelop the right wing of the Roman fleet. The Rhodian commander bringing up the rear spotted this and sailed his ships faster to plug this metaphorical gap. This commander, called Eudamus of Rhodes, then pointed his ship straight at that of Polixenides. Battle was joined, with 80 Roman and Rhodian ships, 22 of them being those from Rhodes, and 89 Seleucid vessels. Livy bangs on about how great the Roman and Rhodian fleets were, but despite his obvious bias, he does point out a genuine advantage. Namely, the Romans had portable fire shooters on the front of some of their ships. Now, apparently this had been key when the Rhodians were enveloped at Panormus. In this battle, whenever a Seleucid ship turned round to avoid the fire, it then collided with other Seleucid ships and got swallowed by fire if it hit anything. The result was a Seleucid rout, with only 2 Roman ships sunk and a few damaged. For reference, 31 Seleucid ships were destroyed and 13 captured. Antiochus III was horrified by this. Seleucid control of the sea was now gone. Without it, Antiochus was not certain he would actually be able to protect his faraway territories. At least, this is what Livy says. In the Mediterranean, I think he might have had a point. However, I don't think Antiochus was particularly worried about Roman troops storming Bactria anytime soon. Regardless, Antiochus abandoned Lysimachia to the Romans, worried about his forces being trapped and defeated there. Livy tells us that, in hindsight, this was a bad decision to make. Antiochus also lifted his siege of Colophon/Notium and fled back to Sardis. He then sent a messenger to Ariarathes IV of Cappadocia to get some more men, while sending out similar envoys in every direction. For their part, the Scipio brothers were taken aback by the surrender of Lysimachia, as it could have actually held out for quite some time. Antiochus had not even taken the supplies of the city but left them behind, which was welcome news to Roman forces now looking to cross over into Asia. Incidentally, Antiochus did not even send forces to help the city of Phocaea. This city, which had once surrendered itself to his son, now flipped back to the Roman side in the winter of 190 to 189 BCE. Heraclides of Byzantium was now sent to the Scipio brothers to ask for peace. Antiochus was prepared to, essentially, withdraw from Europe. He would also allow Smyrna, Lampsacus and Alexandria Troas, all Roman allies, to keep their independent status. In other words, Bevan tells us, he would give up the entire reason he'd been fighting in the first place. Not only that, but he would cough up 50% of the costs of the war. However, the Romans would not be pushed away this easily anymore. They wanted not only to put Antiochus in his place, but ensure that his aggression would not happen again in future. They wanted the entire cost of the war to be repaid. They also wanted Antiochus to abandon everything west of the Taurus Mountains. Remember that these mountains divide Anatolia from the Mediterranean, so it would basically be abandoning Anatolia. Everything Antiochus had regained from Achaeus the Younger would be gone just like that. Note, by the way, that the Seleucid envoy had gone to Scipio Africanus first rather than the consul Scipio, which I think is once again a brilliant snub. Feel free to imagine the consul grinding his teeth. Heraclides had hoped that this Scipio would be more amenable to peace talks, given that, among other reasons, his son was a Seleucid captive. This was his younger son, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, and the younger brother of, let's call him Publius Jr. Lucius the Younger had been taken prisoner earlier in 190 BCE, but would later be sent back without ransom when Africanus fell ill at Elaia after the Romans set their terms and after they'd already crossed over into Asia. Africanus was glad, but sent his son back with a message the only way he could repay Antiochus was the advice that Antiochus III would be better not to attack until Africanus had returned to his camp. I imagine that the sentiment here is something like only Africanus could fight a battle properly so as to defeat the king without hurting him or something similar. However, neither Livy nor Bevan really elaborates, but that's in the future. During the negotiations, the Romans had halted at the Hellespont. Notably, they were already on the Asian side. However, they moved down the coastline when Africanus fell ill at Elaia after the Romans set their terms. Predictably, these terms would not be met. Antiochus was now resolved to beat the Romans on the battlefield. The final note for today is that, during this journey, the Romans reached Troy, believing themselves to have reached the cradle of their civilization. The city where Aeneas had fought before travelling to found Alba Longa over 1,000 years earlier was now in their sights. It's not necessarily relevant to the war effort as a whole, but I thought it was a fun note. We will end the episode today with a quick summary of the situation. After decisively defeating the Seleucid fleet, the Romans have now crossed into Anatolia and terms have been rejected once again. This leads us to the countdown to another one of the seminal battles of the Hellenistic Age, the Battle of Magnesia. However, that's for a future episode. As always, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.